Hello, welcome once again. Peng Global Business, 5th edition. Today we're going to cover Chapter 3 Informal Institutions Related to Culture, Ethics, and Normalities, or Norms. As always, we'll start off. This is not a substitute for you reading the book. This is meant to be a supplement. This is not a substitute for you actually doing a homework. This is a supplement. This is not a substitute for a lecture or anything related that you might have in a class. If you just enjoy the material and you're watching, I appreciate it. However, this is just a support, and goes in tangent with the other work and assignments. If you find this interesting, like, share, all that other good stuff. All right, with that out of the way, we are about to get started. All right. As always, we will be going through the chapter. I will be mentioning the page numbers for those playing at home, and we'll also occasionally keep up with the slides we're going to go through. Objectives for this chapter. Culture, the four main manifestations: language, religion, social structure, and education. How these things affect one another, the importance of ethics to combat corruption, norms and how they work, four leading debates as far as culture, ethics, and norms, and try to draw in a couple of conclusions at the end. Culture, we're on page 66, slide 3. What do we mean by that? Well, simply norms based upon a group. Informal institutions, what is considered acceptable behavior by a particular group, usually based on geography or region or something of that nature. You run into an issue of ethnocentralism, believing that your way is the right way. Anybody else is not thinking clearly, or they're a little off, this, that, and the third thing, whatever that might be. Now, this creates a problem because if you are doing business internationally, you have to respect the cultural norms of the other society, not yours. Those key things happen to be language, religion, the social structure, whatever that might be, and the education and the formalities involved in that. First, let's talk language, not religion. We'll get to that in a minute. More coffee. Business language. Generally, English is the most widely used language in business. Has something to do with the large corporate output, GDP, and profit. And the largest companies in the world, typically they are speaking English as a first or second language. If we're talking purely population, Chinese is 20% of the world's population, so that would be number one if it wasn't for the economic aspect. English is the second most frequently used language, about 8%, followed by Spanish at 7% and Hindu at 6%. As your textbook notes, there are 6,000 languages in the world. Second thing is you need a one language solution in case you run into two countries. It simply makes it easier. If they don't have the same language, you come up with something that is a middle ground and generally accepted in most places. I believe this is what happens in international flights. Now, I haven't checked on this in a while to make sure it's accurate, but I was told that if you're flying internationally as a pilot, you need to speak English. And if you think about it, you're going to need one language. You can't have a pilot trying to learn 50 languages. So the default, I believe, is English. Next, religion. As you can see, the biggest religions in the world: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhist. The second thing that most people have in common when they are a common culture is a common religion or set of beliefs. You need to understand how these things work if you're working internationally. What might be simple cultural habit for you might be a religious habit which might be held in higher reverence. So that's something to think about. Social structure is next. Where do people situate themselves? You're reading that social stratification, hierarchy within a class. There are multiple classes or caste systems. India is known for a very structured caste system. There are actually a couple of books on that. There's actually a book entitled Caste. Deals with how that's set up and other interesting tidbits. I believe India, if I remember the book, there are 6, 7 castes and subgroups within that. Understanding that has a huge difference in other cultures. Who moves up, who moves down. The stronger the caste system, the less social mobility that you're going to have, which is the next point we're trying to make. In many English-speaking countries, there's the opportunity to move up or down in a social class. India, it doesn't move as much. It's slowly changing, but basically, if you are born in a particular caste, you tend to stay in that caste, regardless of everything else. If you'll notice, you look around, the last name or the surname tends to indicate what caste you might be in. Sometimes that's permanent, sometimes it's not. And that's something to think about if you're doing business internationally. You need to know the lay of the land. Let's get back to something in the textbook. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Last, education. Many civilizations tend to focus on how much you learn. It is a bit of prestige in many places. The United States, I believe, leads the world in number of higher educational institutes. By that, I'm referring to institutes that do a lot of research or R1. I think they have more than any other country in the world. It could be wrong. I think it's right up there, though. Your textbook bring in something very interesting. I'm trying to see if I can see that rather quickly. In certain places, it holds a great deal of weight. I believe one country, I think Germany, listed as a professor, Dr. Smith, where in the United States it's one or the other. We don't tend to repeat that. Not that everyone who's a professor has a doctoral degree, but we tend to go one or the other. Cultural differences is next, and we're on slide 9, and we're on page 71. What do we mean by cultural differences? I'm going to break that up into 3 areas. First one is context, the other is a cluster, the last is dimensions, and that's going to be very interesting in a minute. When we're referring to context, what are the underlying meanings? Well, your textbook points out that if it has a low context, it's straightforward. No is no. Just call it what it is. There's nothing dramatic or anything about that. Higher context cultures, as you can see, in Asia all the way over to Middle East, there's subtle differences. You can view that as, well, maybe. Is that really a maybe, or are you trying to say no but being subtle about it? Could be either or, but you have to understand, again, the context of the statement. Are we just being straightforward, or are there little subtleties involved in this? Think about in some of the relationships you have, certain people where it's just a normal everyday conversation. People at work, okay, no means no. Your friends you've known for, a decade or so. Yeah, you know that there are subtle nuances in those statements. Then we talk about particular clusters, again, divided up in regions. Not going to get into this in a lot of detail, but your textbook tends to group these into a couple of divisions: Anglo-Arab, Eastern Europe, Far East, Germanic, Latin America, Latin Europe, Far East, Nordic, and Sub-Sahara Africa. It's in your textbook on page 73. Essentially, you're looking at different, how can we put this in a more general term, those nuances based upon your geographic area. They have a shared history. They have some, again, shared religion, some shared language. They're not that different depending on geography. And from that, they all, quote unquote, wearing the same uniforms. Just because you are geographically in the same area, you tend to wear a bit of the same sports uniforms. I think that's a better analogy. All right, now we're going to get into the last one, which is dimensions. If you are not familiar with this, this is a pretty interesting study known quite well in the business area. Gret Hofstede did a whole lot of study. You can look this up online. There are interviews, videos, the whole 9 yards, on an economist who decided to divide up cultures based upon 5 to 6 key areas. Pardon me. University major. I wouldn't say an economist, probably an economist based upon what he was doing. Broke this up into 6 characteristics we'll get to in the next slide, showing the differences between the countries, how they look towards one another in particular areas. And if you can't read all of that, that's fine. You might want to look at your textbook. However, these are the areas that he divided into. Study was done quite some time ago and has been updated and replicated many times. I believe his son is actually heading the institute that looks into this to keep this thing going and alive. We'll go over these. Again, I think this is pretty interesting. You had a time, you might want to go look this up online. Power distance. How far are you away from one another? And it's not referring to that type of distance. The distance they're actually referring to is monetary. In Brazil, for an example, the top 10% actually control 50% of the income. In Sweden, the top 10% only control 22% of the income. How far are you away from the rich? Individualism or collectivism? Are we a group? Are we striving together? Or is it the infamous pull yourself up by your bootstraps? Your culture may value one or the other. I took a political science class. They focused on that. I took a philosophy class. That was even more. Western culture tends to focus a little more on individualism. Asia, Europe tends to focus a little bit more on collectivism. I believe there's an old African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. So when you're doing business internationally, you need to understand, is it we or me? Other aspects, how much masculinity versus femininity? Are you dealing with a group that's going to be more aggressive, more assertive, or you're being a group that may not have that type of notion and a little more laid back? Understanding where you are at and how they figure these roles is very important. You don't want to insult someone by doing the wrong thing. Avoidance of uncertainty. Perhaps you've heard in many large European nations, the more quote unquote Western nations, job security is number one. Strong unions. Many Asian cultures, job security is job one. You know the company is there for you, you're part of the family. They do a lot as far as not laying people off. That is the last thing they want to do. In the United States, you would like that, but you're more likely to be laid off in the United States in times of company in trouble. Last but not least, what is the company's outlook? And the culture will reflect that. Are you thinking long term or short term? From a business standpoint, trying to come up with some information every quarter on what's going to happen the next 1 or 2 quarters is short term thinking. If you're into this for the long haul, it's not going to bother you as much. So from that aspect, you're not concerned with, well, we're a penny off our estimates for the quarter. Oh, all the world is coming to an end. No, you're not looking at it in that vein. And here's a quick example of that power index we were talking about. You're going through your textbook on page 76. It goes through the criticism of Hofstede's research. Again, that research was done between 1967 and 1973. So you got room for criticism and it needs to be updated. I'm not going to get into this particular slide as far as mistakes that are made. You can read that on your own. Coming up with the slogan, nothing sucks like an executioner's. Yeah, I think it would be kind of funny myself. At least I remember it. See some differences as hiring expatriates and firing expatriates, and using American slang of Roger and Raj and not using the full name. Understanding that it is a title and it means quite a bit. It's not a nickname. It is not the name. All right. Moving on to ethics. We're on page 78. It is a standard of norm, a proper behavior, considered close to cultural norms. Ethics, well, I'll throw in my own 2 cents on this. More in business behavior and conduct with others. Inside of your family, a cultural norm. If you're dealing with someone else, the ethics and you treating others fairly. A little bit of a difference, but there is a difference. There are written and unwritten codes of ethics. If it is written, it's usually some type of contract or law. How you believe your standards compare to others. Again, if you're ethical imperialism, you believe your standards are better, which could create a problem. I think we've mentioned this before on page 79. Tattoos in Japan are seen as a no-no. Tattoos are typically only used by Yakuza, a mafia gang in Japan. If you're a tourist coming in there, they're going to ask you politely to cover up the tattoos. Something to think about if you're going in there and you're one of those people with a lot of tattoos, you may want to cover that up because you're going to get seen and viewed in a slightly negative light, whether you like it or not. That's not what we want. There we go. All right. As a manager, again, just middle of the road approach, being ethical based on most commonly used definitions of that. Be fair, understand the local nomenclature, and understand and respect the institution that you work for and the one that you are with. We're on slide 21, page 80. Not going to go through all of this, but it is a good example of some guidelines. This slide relates to gifts. In China, it is seen as a norm to have gifts. In the US, there's question marks about this. So, in short, if it's something you're comfortable with, little trinkets, that's fine. It starts to get to expensive gifts, then you're getting into a gray area. The reason that you have the ethics is to avoid corruption. The problem that you'll have is that in some areas, in some countries, it's expected to pay a bribe. You have problems if this is the norm. If you got to pay everybody along the way, it's going to take you forever to get business done. In some cultures, again, it is part of the norm. No one cares. You run into a foul when the United States, in particular, has rules against bribery. There's actually some good information on how this creates a problem. Companies being fined and hit with legal actions from the United States federal government for bribery, and their response was, yeah, this is kind of the norm. This is what normally happens. I don't know why you're being upset when we're just following the normal in Rome, doing as Romans do. It's not easy. It's a complicated problem. Ethical imperialism, prohibit company headquarters of one country engaging in bribery and doing it in another country when it's the norm. Difficult situation, cannot answer that quickly. That'll be something for you to worry about, future managers. Norms, in particular, ethical challenges. And we're going from page 81 to 82 and slide 24 on to slide 25. There are a couple of ways that you can do this as far as norms and ethical behavior, broken up into 4 areas. You can be reactive, defensive, accumulative, and proactive. Accommodative. Being reactive is you committing a no-no and then you're trying to do the bare minimum or less than that. Well, we got caught with our hand in the cookie jar, so yeah, we might put the cookie back after we take a bite out of the cookie. A defensive is, oh yeah, okay, we got caught with our hand in the cookie jar, we'll put the cookie back. Accommodative, you're going at least what is required. We accept it, we acknowledge it, we made a mistake, let's apologize. The proactive is, we messed up and we're going to go overboard. And you'll notice 3 of these are automobile related. Generally, textbooks like to note out when there is a problem and you don't correct it. In the automobile industry, that is unfortunately something that happens. They know there's a problem with the car, but they keep manufacturing it. And the idea is, well, we'll fix it later. We'll do a recall. Compared to stopping production, fixing it, that way you don't have the recall. They've done the numbers and it's actually cheaper to do the recall than to stop the line and fix the problem. This is why it continues to this day. Now we get into the fun part. Arguing, debates, etc., etc. As I mentioned earlier, had a philosophy class. Interesting. I enjoyed it. But most of the theories were based on Western values. If the chapter was 20 pages long, 15 pages had to deal with Western values. The last 5 dealt with Eastern values. And as you can see, the Protestant work ethic. The idea of hard work and being frugal. This is how you accumulate capital. And in your textbook hints that this is where you get the idea of capitalism in and of itself. Hard work becomes a reward, a little more money, etc., etc. Eastern values, Confucius, we come up with the idea of we are working together. Now, it doesn't say you don't have to do hard work, but this isn't the whole point of existence. And in some Western cultures, it gets to be known as workaholics, especially in the United States. Well, this all for one and one for all theory, some people believe that is how you saw the great rise in many Asian countries from an economic standpoint. China, Japan, and the Four Tigers, as they're nicknamed, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. It does not guarantee that. And what you should be taking away from this is possibly it depends on the situation and which one would work at that particular moment. Always remember, very few absolutes as far as this goes. What might work in one environment may not work in another. And maybe the environment is changing and you need to change the particular method of doing business. Slide 28, and we're all the way on page 84. Are the cultural norms converging to one point and we'll just have one really big cultural norm globally, or are they separating? It's pretty hard to figure out which it is. Is it moving towards individualism, consumerism, or materialism? It's hard to say, and it tends to go back and forth depending on what's going on. At the time of this recording, I could not tell you. What you believe is probably more important. You will believe that we should be focusing on, hey, you're responsible for your actions, or we should be trying to do this thing as a group. Maybe you want to blend them together. That'll be something to think about. And as you are being put in a position of authority, you might want to figure out when it's a good time to use one or the other, or something in the middle. I would not recommend staying really strict and only using one. And we're going back to what we were discussing as far as the 6 dimensions. Are you opportunistic, or are you individual and collectivism? Opportunistic or opportunism refers to there's a certain uncertainty and you're going to take advantage of that. However, if you're not very trusting, and it's part of the problem, you're going to create others who don't trust you. You normally have to go get a contract. Yes, you have to have legal boundaries, but the more you focus on those type of things, you're going to inadvertently make people believe that you're not trustworthy as well. So, you still go back to informal institutions. Are you part of the group or are you not? Are you wearing the same sports jersey that we are, or are you wearing the enemy? Since football, or what the rest of the world calls football and what the citizens of the U.S. call soccer, they take that very seriously around the world. Are you wearing the team colors locally, or are you wearing those other guys? Slide 30. The cultural distance. This gets back into what we were discussing in the dimensions. Do you believe that we are a collective? Are you believing in individualism? Do you have a situation that calls for one or the other? And then, besides the culture, how does the business do this? You have to look at what's going on in the business. You may need to change the culture, or at least try to change the culture slowly. Doing it overnight generally doesn't work. What is the culture of the company? Good, bad, or indifferent? There's a combination of where you are at and what your company does. And as those who are going to be higher up in the company in management, you have to figure that out. And speaking of management, manager savvy. What do we mean by that? You understand these things within your company and other places that you may be doing business. You have to be aware of those problems. The slide that talked about making mistakes, you got to know where you are at. You got to know the lay of the land and what room you are standing in. Once you realize that it operates under a different system, you have to know what the system is, learn as much as you can, and then become aware of it and figure out how to work within that system, keeping everybody happy as much as you can. So understanding there's a difference, trying to figure out what those are. What are the symbols, the rituals, and the taboos of a particular culture, which goes back to not having tattoos in certain areas, or at least covering them up, and being skillful enough to actually be aware of those and make sure you don't make any mistakes. And last but not least, you understand all of that. The key point I'd say in there, besides being prepared, is to slow down. Rushing into situations without understanding and doing a little research is a recipe for disaster. So, all right, that takes care of most of it. Quick summary of what we already discussed. As always, if you find this interesting, like, share, and all the other good stuff. Hopefully this is helpful. Go out there, make it a good one, and I'll see you in the next one.